Hello, today we're going to be talking about Draft 1 of Project 1 and some information about reviewing forms of communication and the Project 1 focus. One of the things that you want to pay attention to while thinking about Project 1 and drafting Project 1 is the notion of genre. So many times we think of genre as just being film, books, various different thematic themes that we group pieces of information or written communication into. But within academic discourse communities, genres are used for very specific purposes of communication. And so you're going to be able to look at and investigate those types of genres that are used within your discourse community. Genres within discourse communities have very specific formats depending upon the discourse community that you are involved in. This means that for some discourse communities, such as the sciences, you will use APA. For others, you may use MLA or AMA. But formats is not just about the citation, but it is also about the structure in which the genre is written and formatted. So as you'll see in some of the responses that I gave to you based upon your personal research statements and your interviews, you're going to want to make sure that you investigate the type of structure that is required of academic writing in your field. So for instance, scientists who are in their academic discourse communities when publishing will often use what's called an IMRD format. That means that they use very specific headings with very specific information placed within those headings so that the user can easily go to various sections to find the specific information they need. So in the scientific discourse communities, the IMRD stands for an introduction section, and that is where they typically introduce the research topic and the importance of that topic. They then quickly move into the methods section, which is one of the larger sections for the IMRD format, in which they conduct and discuss the methods that they will use for their research. And it's very much like a recipe without any subjective voice, without any explanation as to why the methods were used necessarily, but simply representing the validity of using such methods. They then move into the results of the methods that they've conducted, and this again is a very large section, and this often includes charts, visuals, statistical information, and analysis. Then they move into their discussion section, which they discuss what does this all mean. And for many people who are entering into this discourse community and have not yet become familiar with this type of format and structure for writing, the best places for a novice reader would be to go into the introduction section of that article and the discussion section, understanding that the methods and results section might be too technical at this point for them to understand, yet they'd still be able to get the gist of the research and the purpose and the outcome of that research by simply reading the introduction and the discussion section. So you want to make sure that you understand that genres have these very specific formats and these very specific structures, and these formats and structures are not randomly assigned to one's discourse community. They in fact constitute the goals, the knowledge, the beliefs, and the expertise that is required to be a member of this discourse community. So genres are not some kind of preconceived or kind of just naturally occurring type of genre. They're actually produced by those who are members in that discourse community for very, very specific knowledge, very, very specific beliefs about knowledge, very, very specific understandings of expertise required to be a member, and actually makes one think a certain way because of those beliefs and knowledge and goals. So for instance, a really kind of silly comparison would be that when I have conversations with my dad, who's a math professor, he sometimes tries to get me to understand equations, which, of course, me being humanities-based, I have a hard time wrapping my mind around very abstract calculus equations. And so my immediate response is to always ask why, and why can't you do it this way or that way? And it's very hard for him to sometimes explain why, because He's thinking about knowledge and the representation of that knowledge in a very different way that I am. So I asked the question of, why couldn't I make an equation where the amount of friends plus the amount of years of being friends would equal the amount of happiness with your friendship? And he started to laugh and said, that's not a possibility. And I said, well, why not? And he said, it's too abstract. And I said, well, some of the equations you're showing me are also abstract. But see, our belief systems and what we see as being important and what we're trying to research and understand are so different that the way that that information is structured, the way that information is represented, talked about, and even written about is going to be very different depending on the field that you're in. The other thing that you need to understand that genres are very active, and so they are actively created by the discourse community to represent the goals, knowledge, and beliefs. So genres aren't some static kind of placeholders in which we place information and one then goes and reads about, but rather they're actively communicating with those members. They're actively representing the knowledge and beliefs within that community, and they are actively influencing how people respond to one another, how they research, how they communicate, and how they consider what is important to research and what is not. And therefore genres ask users to change their ways of knowing and their ways of doing when becoming members within that discourse community. So you'll see that the more that you become a member of a discourse community, or even when you investigate the discourse community that you're about to enter into through your interview, you're going to see that the way that professionals in the field think about knowledge, the way they know things, the way they do things, is going to be very different from you because you are still a novice. And oftentimes, some of the responses to your interview questions might not be as robust as you had hoped because they already are assuming that you have that kind of implicit ways of knowing and doing because they've been members of that discourse community for so very long. All right, so one of the things that you want to think about then for the roles of genres in Project One is you want to begin to think about and ask questions about how are genres used in your discourse community. What are their purposes? What are they trying to communicate? What knowledge do they extend? What beliefs do they implicitly hold? What format is used and why is that format used? So why is it, for instance, that the humanities use MLA and the sciences use APA? Well, in the humanities, we consider all knowledge as being useful, and it's not necessarily as changing as that in the scientific community. So we usually use the present tense. We believe that knowledge that was created back in the 1800s is still applicable today, whereas in the scientific field, knowledge is always changing, it's always being advanced. We typically use past tense because knowledge is therefore seen as being slightly invalid, and we also use past tense because we also understand that knowledge is so quickly evolving that by the time we start to discuss it, something might have already changed regarding that concept or theory. You also want to investigate what structure is used and why. So you need to ask questions about how is writing structured. That means how is it laid out? What type of headings might there be? What type of voice? What type of tense is used? What type of audience is assumed will be reading these genres? These are very important questions to ask as well. You also need to ask the individuals in your field what type of knowledge, beliefs, and goals are presented in the genres that are used and published in this discourse community, and why are these genres being used rather than others. And finally, you want to ask if there are different genres used and for what purpose. So you'll find that within a discourse community there's going to be academic genres in the form of research and publication. There's going to be maybe scholarly and conference types of genres. There'll be day-to-day genres that might be not as large as a research article, but still just as important, such as charts or patient's notes that, if not used and used correctly, can kind of spell the death for that discourse community. One thing that you also want to consider when doing Project One draft is your interpretation of the interview responses. You need to use the knowledge gleaned from both your library conference and your interviews as data. So you'll get maybe a little bit more from your library conference regarding the types of genres you use, the types of journals that are privileged in that field, the type of format that is used, and the basic overall arching kind of goals or purposes of writing in the field. But you'll also receive some of that information as well as maybe a more in-depth or implicitly held information about a discourse community from your professional interviews. Suggestions for using your interview responses: you want to first group similar responses. So what I usually like to do is take all my responses and highlight similarities in different colors. So any response that is responding to, say, the purpose of research, I might highlight in blue, and then those responding to the day-to-day activities, I might highlight in green, and so forth. Next, you need to analyze those responses, and so it's your job to kind of look at and see what your respondee is actually saying in response to your questions, and whether or not they're answering exactly what you were hoping them to answer. And if they haven't, even if they have, you need to uncover the hidden assumptions or tacit knowledge that they present in their responses. It's kind of your job to be an archaeologist, to kind of get at the nitty-gritty, to kind of uncover what they're kind of saying but not saying when they respond. So if they say, for instance, that we don't really use a lot of form of personal and face-to-face communication in our discourse community, however, we do make sure that we all have specific types of charts and genres that we use, and if not done correctly, then the efficiency of the medical office is put at risk. They actually are using those genres as forms of communication, and they're using it for very particular ways, and each member uses different genres for different tasks and knowledges, and so it's your job to uncover those implicitly responses that you get from the interview. Make sure that you also connect these responses to your own growing knowledge of your discourse community. So I need to see your kind of reflective response to these interview responses. I don't want to see you just laying out a bunch of information that you received from your interview without any type of reflection upon them, any kind of reflection upon what that actually means about your discourse community and what it actually means for you as you start to become a member of that discourse community, and what you need to learn and acquire to be an active member. And you also need to make sure you use the responses, and you need to analyze and reflect upon those responses. So don't just plop in the interview responses and say, this is about genre conventions, and move on. What is it about that response that is about genre conventions? Why is this an important example that you're using to replicate or to represent this idea of genre conventions in your field? What does that say about your field's idea of knowledge, belief, goals, expertise? These are key terms. The Swale's 6 characteristics are key terms I should be seeing over and over again in your Draft 1 and in your analysis of the interview responses. And finally, when you draft up your Project 1, remember this is a draft. So please write accordingly. This does not have to be perfect. This is supposed to be you getting your ideas out on paper. I'd rather see mistakes and more content than a very perfectly drafted introductory paragraph. Also remember, this is your chance to ask me questions, so do so. What I'd like to see is that if there's certain sections that you're not clear of, if you're not sure if you've included the information correctly, if you're not sure you've done the analysis in the way that I've asked, or want to see, place in those questions in those sections either in a different text font and color, or you can use the Word comment feature to highlight certain sections of your text to pose questions to me. That way I can respond to concerns that you have when I am responding to your draft, rather than just what I perceive as being maybe necessary to look at. Also remember, the more develop the draft, and that doesn't mean well-crafted, perfect words, but that just means have you maybe drafted up a first draft that covers all the points that you're being asked to cover, the more feedback you'll receive and the better off you'll be. And do remember the goal of this project. This project is a chance for you to use primary research to investigate your discourse community and how those 6 characteristics developed by Swales and by Johns are represented in your discourse community. So you very much want to make sure that you're looking at how various different types of actions, whether it be reading,